If this were just a market-based outcome, then the merger might be, but it's not a market-based outcome. There's an agenda here to undermine certain parts of our sector. And therefore, if you merger them out of existence, you're ultimately doing what the government may want in their own agenda.
You know, when we think about risk and the kinds of risks that different folks are facing in this environment, you know, there are institutions, of course, that are facing various kinds of risk. And then we think about individuals who are often using nonprofit services and the risk that they are facing.
You'd think that a foundation would want to have 2 years of grant making, like totally flexible grant making spending, always sitting there for these moments that are happening right now.
Welcome to another exciting edition of our little program here, Break Fake Rules. I'm joined today by one of our fabulous co-hosts, Mr. Eric Brown. Eric, how are you? Where are you? You look like you have changed your studio dramatically today.
I get around. I'm at an undisclosed location in Marin County, a place that you know very well.
Yes. I have heard of that place. So what have you been up to? What's been happening in the life of Eric Brown?
Oh my goodness. Nothing nearly as interesting. Watch, this is what's known as a pivot. Nothing nearly as interesting as what's happening in the world of Glen Galaich, because you had a book that came out and I just can't wait to hear about how it's going, because you kind of gently tweaked the nose of some of the thing that we love and know so well, philanthropy. And I'd be dying to know what kind of feedback you're getting.
Well, I will tell you, there is a nice pivot. By the way,
Thank
well
you
done.
Very much.
Well done. Here's the amazing part of it that I've seen so far, and I don't think this is going to be a breakthrough experience that I've had with this book. That others who may have been disrupting systems or tried to disrupt systems have, I'm sure they've experienced something similar, and that is there's like an agreement that your message is right, but the messenger is not. So there's kind of like, your approach, your tone. I've been referred to as insulting to some people. I've been called harmful to some people. And okay. I've noticed that underneath it is like you're right, what you're saying. In fact, I've seen written statements to people where they've said, you're right, we should do more. We should take this on. But when I've met with some of the people who, some of the people have been really amazing. They've wanted to have like a constructive conversation with me about the book, who clearly know that the things I'm saying need to be addressed. And their answer is, even after they've said publicly, you're right, we need to do this, we have to do this. Then I get on with them privately and they say, I can't do anything. There's nothing I can do. I haven't loved the public call outs, but I guess I deserve it. I deserve it because I do it too, right? So if
sure,
you got to accept when you're doing it and getting it back the other way. That's fine. But what I have also appreciated is just the time to kind of reflect, to have people talk to me directly, to share their honest views. And I'm kind of thinking about how to respond in a way that's productive going forward.
Well, that's good. This is nice.
Yeah.
This is what happens, though, when you put yourself out there, right? You're going to get feedback. Some of it's going to be heads and some of it's going to be tails.
Exactly.
But it also sounds
exactly.
And I totally agree with you that I do believe that the message about how philanthropy can do better and the ways that it can do better is really important. We all need to hear it. And I also understand how some folks might get a little bit defensive. It's true.
Right.
And some folks may feel like they don't have the power, as you say, to be able to change an organization in the way that they would like to. But I also suspect that there may be conversations with people about what they think that they can do over time, or how we can begin to steer this, whatever you want to call it, a tanker of philanthropic practice. Are there any things that you're hearing back about, well, okay, you're right, it was tough love, we heard it, some people were not really thrilled about it, but we do think that we can begin to turn things around? What are those conversations like?
Look, it's not only are people saying they can begin to, they are doing it. So if I'm doing a back of the envelope calculation right now, I think I can say pretty safely that we have influenced with this book and follow-on conversations about $2 billion in assets. that have moved down the spectrum or are going to move down the spectrum from a position of some point of control into more of one around community engagement and a comfort with the implications of that, whether it be spending down, spending out, bringing different board members on. There has been a very positive response in many ways, and I appreciate you turning our conversation back that way.
You're very welcome. Hey, this conversation reminds me about our guest today. Very much looking forward to this conversation with Elisha Smith Arrillaga of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, who earlier this year released a report which talked about some of the things that your book gets at, which is that foundations are holding on when the sector, the nonprofit world, feels like they need less holding on and more giving.
Yeah.
And so now they just produced this follow-up research piece in which they talk to CEOs of nonprofit organizations, the grantees, about the challenges that they're experiencing. What are you most interested in hearing from Elisha about that report?
I'm hoping that the report might have information in it about how foundations can start to be more responsive, something that's going to be helpful to these nonprofit CEOs. But I know, without giving too much away, that that might not all be in there, right?
Say more about that, Glenn.
Well, I mean, look, this is part of a series of reports that have come out from CEP. This is their research division, right? And Elisha is very good about using a phrase that I wish I used more, which is what the data show. The data show. She's good about that. And I promise that in this interview, having spoken with her many times, she has this powerful position of being able to say what the data show is that many, many, many foundations, at least based on the sample they've spoken to across this series of reports, are living in a different universe from what nonprofits are living in. So what I'm hopeful for, and I'm hoping Elisha will help us with this a little bit, is where's the bridge here? Where can we find the bridge? Right. How can we entice foundations out of whatever universe they're into and over to reality, which I do believe nonprofits are living in more than foundations these days.
And I mean, we're hearing reports about foundations saying that they have to merge or they have to lay people off or they don't know where their next funding is coming from. I mean, they're not making this stuff up. Now, this is interesting, though, because they also have a lot of qualitative data. They have stories in there in which they are talking to CEOs of nonprofits about their personal experiences. And so we're getting, numbers, but we're also getting people and we're getting a sense of what those folks are going through. And if I may just kind of take a moment to defend you, sir, I think that when in your book, you're telling your own story, which is that, hey, look, this is my perspective. And as a result of that perspective, I'm a little irritated. I feel that my sector needs to do better and things like that. But I mean, you're just telling your story, right?
Yeah. And, there are things that I realize now as I'm getting questions about, well, what do we need to do? I was talking with a group about this the other day. Foundations do not invest mostly in like Schwab mutual funds. They're in really complex, highly cultivated hedge fund structures. They're in complex real estate schemes. They're in private equity. When you go to those folks and say, I would like to put some of our money in your dynamic, sophisticated machinery, many will tell you, well, we'll think about it. We'll see if you qualify. And if you do qualify, we own your money. We've got your money and you don't get to have it back until we're done with it. And so when you think about that, if a lot of foundations, this is just one simple concept within a complex structural problem. If your money is tied up in stuff that has a long tail to it, or you have made agreements that you will not ask for it back, and even if you did, they're not going to give it back, how do you then liquidate enough money to address a crisis like this one? Even when you try. So I talk about this in Control, that we went through that process and we had lots of funds where they came back to us and said, well, we can get you your money back in 6 to 8 months. And many said, we're never going to give your money back, but thanks for asking.
Right.
Or we're going to give it back Well, it ends up for us being never, because we're a spend down. And many of these private equity accounts that we were in were going to go beyond our spend down. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds a little weird.
It is weird. But these are the things that foundations get themselves in. But there certainly needs to be far more conversation and more pushback on some of the traditional ways that foundations are acting out there, because we have, as CEP has documented time and time again, these crises come up, and we need to be able to respond differently in a crisis than a day-to-day thing. And if we're going to do that, we have to set ourselves up to do it, and we're not set up.
Oh, I totally agree. And this is interesting because when a funder looks at a grantee, they say, like, okay, how many months of salary can you pay? You know, we want folks to have enough liquid capital so that they can pay bills if nothing comes in. You know, we want them to be flexible and want to be liquid, but our own investments don't reflect that. And I think about these kinds of fancy pants investments, like I'm investing in the creation of a skyscraper. And first you got to buy the property, and then you got to pour a foundation, and then, you know, and you put up the steel. And let's just say you need the money when the steel is up. You can't sell that skyscraper until the damn thing is built. And, and you know, you're locking up all this money in the hope that in 5 or 10 years, the market will be your friend and you can sell it. You'd think that a foundation would want to have 2 years of grant making, like totally flexible grant making spending, always sitting there for these moments that are happening right now. And it sounds to me like not enough of them have anything close to that kind of liquidity.
It's hard to say. I mean, it's going to vary. I don't know. But I guess I would say at the very least, they should have a crisis fund ready to go that's liquid.
Yeah.
Something that's available when these things come. And, you know, you've had some very prominent foundations talk about setting their spending from 5 to 6, sometimes to 7. Well, another way to do that in quieter times when the crisis is not underway might be to say, all right, well, let's keep going at 6, 7, 8%, but let's carve off the top, you know, that additional 1, 2, 3 into a liquid fund that will be ready for the next crisis so we can move fast.
Right.
Maybe there'll be more thinking about this in the future.
Last little metaphor I'll draw in here is that if you're a climate funder, you realize that the 100-year hurricane or the 100-year weather event is now happening every 10 years or maybe even 5 years, that our own understanding of what crisis has changed completely. And I would submit to you that politically speaking, we are in climate change, and that the, whatever you want to call it, the 100-year political catastrophe is now happening every 5 years or 3 years or 2 years. I mean, we had COVID, which was not predictable, but we had to respond to it. And now you have these kind of political oscillations that we just do not know what the future will hold. And so therefore we can't expect that anything is going to happen the way it used to.
Wow. I think what you're trying to say is that we can't keep doing the things we've been doing. It's time to do things differently.
Yeah.
And there you go. We're going to break some fake rules, what it's going to come down to.
I agree.
What do you think about bringing Elisha on? I think she might have something to say about this.
I think it's the perfect segue to talk to Elisha Smith Arrillaga. Imagine you run a nonprofit and you've got 2 very important sources of funding. The first source is trying to figure out how it can cut your budget and strip your tax status. The second source was created by an act of Congress to do the exact opposite, to support your organizations that hold this country together. Now, let's play a little game, shall we? Which source of funding do nonprofit leaders say is harder to get money from these days? According to the Center for Effective Philanthropy's new State of Nonprofits report, if you get money from both government and foundations, the foundation is the tougher ask right now. Earlier this year, today's guest on Break Fake Rules co-authored a report that exposed the deep disconnect between how foundations think they're showing up these days and how nonprofits actually experience them. This new report measures what that disconnect has cost. CEO burnout has skyrocketed in the past year. Mergers are on the table. And a lot of foundations, it turned out, have decided that the safest thing to do right now is hunker down. Please welcome the Vice President of Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, Elisha Smith Arrillaga. I have a sneaking suspicion that we are about to break some fake rules.
How exciting. Welcome, Elisha.
Thanks so much for having me.
Here's my big question. All right. Actually, the real question is, your last report, Sector in Crisis, there was some tough stuff in there, particularly about foundations. I'm really curious to get your take on what the response has been. What have you hearing back from foundations about what those findings revealed?
That report's been now downloaded thousands of times. And what we're hearing from a lot of folks is that it really shined a light for them on the disconnect. Especially there's some data in the end of that report that shows almost 90% the funders think they understand what their grantees are experiencing, where the grantee number is closer to 40%. And what we always try and remind folks is that we asked that same question back in 2014, and there was not that discrepancy between the two at all. And so we're just hearing a lot of surprise from funders, especially around that disconnect and the desire to really be out there more and understand what's happening in the communities that they're working in.
I am glad to hear that. So my question to you is, I'll give you my perception is that these are challenging findings for the sector to grapple with, given the reports you put out around CEO burnout, around perception, as Eric outlined it, and now this latest one, better to go to the government than to go to a foundation. Yikes. That's like the last thing anybody wants to hear in the foundation sector. What is the response? Is there one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say it's been met with really mixed response. There are a lot of a lot of foundations that are doing all kinds of innovative thinking and shifting how they're giving, whether that's increasing their payout or starting whole new lines of, different programming than they were before and funding new groups or doubling down on the groups they were funding before. I also heard from other funders who, really asked the question, is this moment that different than any other moment? And one of the things that the Center for Effective Philanthropy that we did last fall was we had a big conference in LA, and we actually brought in a historian, Ben Soskis from the Urban Institute to talk about, is this moment really that different? And what we see both in our data and we heard from Ben is that, yes, it is a very different moment. And what we're seeing from many funders is that they are not necessarily responding as if it is that different of a moment from the past.
Well, the part that struck me, and I had the benefit of being on a panel recently with one of your colleagues, and Sierra and I were kind of thinking about that history together. One thing that stands out to me in this time is that when you look back at the other moments when foundations have tended to withdraw or get more protective, it's because we are all been facing something, a recession, a pandemic. The interesting thing about this moment is that this artificial crisis, I call it artificial, people will question that word, but it came out of nowhere, and it was completely created by an entity, in this case, the new administration. And it really did not, in the cutting down of available government money, it did not, in fact, impact the foundation sector. And on top of that, foundations, if they were just invested in the stock market alone, saw the market go 10,000 points up last year in the midst of all this. So while the world was coming down, foundations are going up. What a different situation that is. So I find that even more confounding that foundations have been in a protective and retreat position. So I guess I have two questions. One is, what kinds of activity have you seen in response to it? And if you're able, do you feel it was productive? Did your research say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of response, well, one of the things we asked about that I think kind of hits on this point is we, in the Sector in Crisis report, asked both funders and nonprofits about risk and how much risk they felt like they were experiencing. And there was discrepancy also in some of that data in terms of, the kinds of risk folks felt they were experiencing, the levels of risk. And just anecdotally, I would say my own personal opinion is, when we think about risk and the kinds of risk that different folks are facing in this environment, there are institutions, of course, that are facing various kinds of risk, whether that might be the likelihood they're sued or and they have to navigate that or called out publicly in some way. And then we think about individuals who are often using nonprofit services and the risk that they are facing of being detained and deported on their way to work, or the risk of not having food that day because the food bank closed because of lack of funding. And I think those are very different kinds of risk. And we haven't, what I haven't seen in the conversations we've been having about the report often is this kind of recognition that yes, there are risks to all kinds of parties, but the risks to some are much greater, and the impacts are much more, much more impactful. So I think that's one of the pieces that has not been in the conversation as much that I think is super important for folks to be thinking about as we continue to operate in this environment.
Well said.
Wow. No kidding.
Well said.
Hey, so Elisha, you also mentioned that nonprofit leaders are talking about like taking some pretty extreme measures like mergers or trying to share resources and things like that. So on the one hand, you might say, okay, that's efficient for nonprofits and that's a good thing. A, do you think that they think it's a good thing? And B, are there any other things that nonprofits are doing to try and respond to this very strange set of circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, this one's a super hard one, Eric, I would say. And for me, one of the most distressing is that in the data from this year's State of Nonprofits, we see that the number of organizations that are reporting a deficit, for instance, has increased. And it's one of the first times since we've been collecting the data that we've seen that. And as I've presented, this data in different rooms, especially actually in boardrooms, one of the first responses I get often when I talk about the increased number of organizations that are facing deficits, they're having to think about merging, and the response more often than I think is productive. Well, aren't there too many nonprofits anyway? Like, isn't this just kind of a moment of survival of the fittest? And I think, well, first of all, it's not like a very nuanced question, right? Because we know, for instance, the federal government has not provided funds to organizations that provide domestic violence, like $200 million. Those organizations are still waiting for those funds. So they've had to make all kinds of cuts. And I would argue, given that, if there are 5 domestic violence organizations that are all doing the same thing, I don't think that's too many of them. I don't think that was too many of them even before the cuts happened. So I think, we're in this moment where we're getting that question a lot. And I think that's the wrong question, right? The question has to be, well, exactly what kind of, or what are we talking about, right? Does merging mean that less people will get fed or have a meal that day? I don't think that's a productive merger then. So I think there are some more questions to be asked there. And, we're hoping that this report kind of at least highlights the situation we're in and helps people ask some more of those nuanced questions.
Underlying your comment is something so powerful. The way you frame that, basically, if you are agreeing that this is an opportunity to see contraction in the sector, the driver of that contraction is the agenda of the White House. I do think this is where these things kind of crash together in dangerous ways. If this were just a market-based outcome, then the merger might be, but it's not a market-based outcome. There's an agenda here to undermine certain parts of our sector. And therefore, if you merger them out of existence, you're ultimately doing what the government may want in their own agenda. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. The question I have also is, if I were to purchase a cloak of invisibility, can I join you at some of these board meetings that you go to? Can I
Of course. Yes. I'm like, if that is possible, I want one too.
Okay. Because I know CEP's done a tremendous number of grantee perception reports for us that have had, as I've written in my book, they had deep impact on the course of Stupski's life. But we've never really had CEP come in and present on research that I recall. It may have happened once way back when. Do you do that often?
We do. And especially recently, we actually put out a snapshot last month that was focused just on how boards and CEOs are navigating this moment at foundations. And so, one of the things that we're really hoping, and actually with the last report we released and with the State of Nonprofits, we started doing these 2-page versions of the report that we call a board book insert. And our hope is that more boards can quickly get this information and use it to have more of a level playing field about understanding the state of the sector in this moment.
Wow, that's great.
All right. So, Elisha, you've done this report now for several years in a row. Let's look forward a year to 2027 when you release your new state of the field report. If you could have your way, what would some of the findings be for next year? What are foundations doing in a positive way that would make you smile?
Well, my hope would be, that we're seeing less of the financial issues that we see in terms of increasing deficits. And that is not only because foundations have stepped up their payout in different ways, but also because they're providing, one of the things that we see in a lot of our data is just more and more requests for capacity building support. So whether that's legal support or support for, some of the back office functions that they may have had to consolidate as an organization, right? Like maybe an organization had to hire an outside accounting firm because they could no longer do that work internally, but just more nonprofits experiencing that kind of wraparound support from their funders would be great. I also think that one of the best things would be if those numbers that I talked about earlier that were so far apart were much closer together, because my concern right now is if grantees and funders are so far apart on understanding what the challenges are that we're facing in this moment, then we both must think we're solving different problems, and that's an issue. So my hope would be that next year also we see those numbers come much closer together like they have been in the past.
So I'm going to riff off of that just a little bit. First, I'm going to say I have 1 year to get that cloak. So I'm going to get that done.
Okay.
Because I've got some meetings to attend with you when you get that data out.
Maybe just wear a disguise.
Why?
Go dress like Phil.
Why?
Get you a Phil Buchanan disguise.
Yeah.
Phil's going to be like, I've got a better head of hair, man. Let's get to the big final question here, which we ask all of our guests when they come on this show. And I know you come from a place of research, so I don't want to put you in a bad position here, but I'll be interested to hear what a researcher has to say is the most important fake rule you want to see the sector break. What is that?
Well, I believe the most important fake rule to break is that we need a strategy to solve every problem. And, not to say that you want to go in without knowing what you're going to do at every step of the way. But I think the data shows that right now we're in a perilous moment for the sector. And that doesn't mean that we need to take 9 to 12 months to then plan what we need to do. Some of what we need to do right now is just make sure domestic violence victims can go to organizations that can serve them. There is a solution right now that requires making sure those organizations have the resources they need that they haven't received. And so, I think there's sometimes we get caught up in like, we need to have a plan. And I think that is true at moments. And there's always something we can do right now that doesn't necessarily require a plan, but requires some action.
That's hands down. That's got to be one of the best fake rule breaking recommendations we've heard all season. I couldn't. Again, it's hard to top that.
Yay.
That's a huge one. That's a huge one. Elisha, it's always so great to see you. You always bring so much for us to think about. I'm so grateful that you're out there doing the work that you do, and thank you for coming on Break Fake Rules.
Well, thanks so much for having me.